Has begun. Okay. Hi guys, how are you doing? We're gonna be working on conditioning today. Hopefully I can get everything done. If I can't get it done in 40 minutes, I'm gonna be making a part 2, but that's for later. For now, we're gonna be covering everything that revolves around conditioning, like how to get conditioning started, when you can use it, the effects of it, and everything revolving around it. And then if we can get to the last few sections, we can get into more advanced topics like alternating between rounds, making sure that we understand things like, breaking a condition, using ultimates to condition, things like that. Okay. For now, let's get started. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about conditioning. So conditioning is a concept from psychology. Okay. It is straight up a learning concept that has been studied. And it comes from just the basic fact that living things, humans, love to learn. It's a basic form of learning, okay, and it usually comes through repetition. So let me give you an example of something that you might expect. Let's say that you are playing the round and the enemy team has a KJ. You hear them coming in through A, and the KJ has ult. What do you expect based on the repetition of what you see in your rounds happen? What do you expect? Any takers? Again, KJ has ult. They are coming A. What's the basic thing that your brain thinks? No takers?
It's a lurk.
It's a lurk. KJ ult. Okay? Something simple. They have ult. They're running it down, right? Maybe make it something simple. They're running it down. They have breach ult. Maybe this is a better example. They have ult, right? So you're going to expect that they're going to use it. This is just because you've seen it so many times that you're going to be like, okay, they're probably going to ult. So you get yourself ready, you reposition, you position yourself in a place where you're able to be either safe or you can counter the strat that they're about to do. Okay, that's just a very blatant example of conditioning. Okay, to condition the enemy, right? You need to start creating patterns. Okay, you want to make sure that you're doing these patterns with the intention of making the enemy expect it, so you can then break that form and use it against them. Okay. You're essentially going to make the enemy fall on their own sword, if you will. They're expecting something, they're going to counter strat it, but then out of nowhere, it just doesn't fit whatever they were trying to do. Okay, so with that out of the way, right, we're going to be talking a little bit about how exactly we can get conditioning done. So don't be afraid to use it on either side. Both of these rules that we're about to just discuss, they apply to both sides. So let's talk about both sides. So here are some rules that you guys need to consider when you're about to think of conditioning. First of all, you got to understand that some pieces of utility are more effective than others. Okay, if you're seeing someone at the beginning of the round, for example, on Sunset, and we have Sova, and every single time at the beginning of the round he throws that dart, right? You're gonna expect it. However, when it is a piece of utility like the dart that comes back over time, you're not going to respect it as much. You might sometimes wait it out. You might shoot it. You might make a play around it. This itself is not enough to sell a push. It's not enough to sell some sort of danger. When we're looking at conditioning, this first rule of thumb indicates that there needs to be some sort of reaction. There needs to be some sort of danger. Dart itself does not provide danger. It just gives some sort of information, right? So when you're using this, right, you got to make sure that you're putting some sort of pressure behind them. So a good example of this might be if you're using something like a dart, you can sell a condition by making noise or pushing off of it, right? So maybe the dart starts over here and then you just hear footsteps coming up from tiles. This is a good example, and we should do something like this, right? You can kind of expect at this point in time that there is a threat behind the dart. If every single time you use a dart and there are footsteps behind it, then you know that this means a threat, okay? So they're pretty easy to read and expect, at least the utility with cooldowns. So you got to make sure that when you're using this piece of utility, you are kind of ensuring that if you are not putting you're not putting any presence behind it, that is just not going to do much. So again, make sure that you're paying attention to the utility that you have. Okay. Second one is that when you're using utility to create some sort of conditioning effect, there is utility that is finite. So for example, like his drone, and this provides a bigger response. It's easier to create a routine around something that does not come back. So a good example of this is when we look at something like Sky. So back then, Sky would just, you know, senselessly throw the flash just to get information, very similarly to how we were using Dart. But now that Sky has finite flashes, you're going to notice that they need to take a more deliberate approach as to which one is going to be used. Are we going to throw a flash here? Are we going to actually use a flash? You're going to notice that most of the time a flash will now mean that there's some sort of push happen. Okay, so just be aware that when the flash is happening, you will expect the push to happen behind it just because of the way that the flash works. And this is just talking about how finite utility you'll expect some sort of danger. Okay, try to make sure that when you use utility, you just don't throw it away. So make sure that you're clearing with that utility. Otherwise, you're not really going to have any benefit behind it. Okay, here's the second rule. Conditioning doesn't happen after one round. If you are planning to condition, make sure that you're looking at the agent you're playing with and you have that rule in mind. So for example, let's look through the roster real quick here and let's see which ones can and cannot condition. Astra can condition. She can put stars down, which can provide some sort of imminent danger and in some form of unsafe space. Breach, again, flashes, concuss, drill. He's a really perfect example of it. What about someone like Brimstone? Can he condition? Yes or no?
Yes.
Why is that? You're not wrong.
He has a molly.
A molly is a good example. I wonder how you would use a molly for conditioning. That's kind of interesting. You're forgetting his essential part of his kit, smokes. They don't come back.
I said smokes.
Right? So that's one example of something that you can use there. So again, what about something like Chamber? Can they condition?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, they can, but you're going to notice that it's not utility based, right? This one does not have any utility. So on the topic of it, you're going to actually have to put some presence. So not really conditioning, not really one to condition. You can, but we're talking necessarily from the utility that you can use. What about Cypher? Can you condition with his utility? Yes, camera, right? Like stuff like that. Deadlock, you could probably use...
Actually, I have no idea. I don't even see that character ever.
Well, this one's pretty easy. I mean, you can just kind of look at the way barrier happens. Let's say, for example, you're pushing down a lane and barrier happens every single time. You can condition yourself into thinking this is going to happen. So that's a good response, maybe. Fade, pretty simple. You have eye, right? Same thing with like the dart. You have dogs that you can condition with. Same thing with Gecko. And I think down the line, you guys start kind of understanding which characters can or cannot. There's some that have a really hard time, and that's going to be the duelists. Duelists have a hard time using utility, same thing with Chamber over here, to creating some form of conditioning, right? They can, but at the end of the day, we have to make sure that while we're looking at those characters, while you can condition with them, utility-wise, it's a lot harder, okay? So when you're playing your character, pay attention to which one you picked, and then think about what are some things that you can do behind it, because you want a minimum of 3 rounds to be able to start conditioning the enemy properly. If you're just starting at the beginning of the round and you throw the smoke right there, that's not going to do anything. If at the beginning of the round, you swing over here, that's not going to do anything. After 3 rounds, this becomes a pattern, this becomes a pattern, right? Start paying attention to what exactly it is that you're using. Right now, we're talking about utility mostly. We can jump into like agents themselves and how you can use presence for it. Okay. Next rule, condition can be used for info denial. Okay. Let's say, again, we're talking Sky or we're talking something like Sova. They use some sort of piece of utility. They get information. Okay, that's what's happening here. But what if they don't do it for 1 round? What does that mean? Does that mean that they're not here? Does that mean that they're holding without it? Does that mean that they rotated to another site? Does that mean they're holding on to it? Those questions will appear simply because you conditioned the enemy to expect something and then you took it away. This is how you can start looking at conditioning as a form of information denial, and you can drain utility from the enemy. Okay. Last rule, once the enemy is conditioned, okay, ideally do not make noise at the beginning of the round. When you're conditioning, you got to make sure that if you're going to make noise, it has some sort of intention. So like I said, if you're doing this condition right here of peeking, then of course you want to make noise. But if multiple people start making noise this way, you're not really doing anything with that condition. You're just making noise, right? So don't give it away. Do not remove the suspense and the motivation for the enemy to look for your location, okay? So Since we covered those rules of thumb, I remember telling you guys a long time ago when I covered this topic that when you guys are trying to get conditioning done, it is as early as possible. That's why I told you guys to look at your agents and to look at your kits. Because the best way to set conditioning is to start early in the game. Usually when you look at a game, most players think that the game resets at the half and they can start conditioning, right? But that's not actually the case. So let's say you're really good at conditioning on defense, but you got attack first. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what you do on defense. The enemy already has an expectation of how you play. Now, I don't particularly hate the idea. I don't particularly think that you shouldn't try in case you suck on one half. That's perfectly fine. But you should always aim, and I always tell players this, you should always aim to get some of it done, some conditioning done at the beginning of the game. So let's say, for example, you want to condition the enemy that you are a really aggressive pusher. So you make aggressive push after push after push, right? Again, really generic example. So what is the enemy going to expect on defense? Well, a pushback, right? At the beginning of the round. This is how you can use it to make expectations of what the enemy is going to think about what you're going to do. Okay. So that's why you want to make sure that you're doing this as early as possible. It is very effective for that reason. Okay. So like we mentioned, not all agents are the same for conditioning, right? They can all create some form of space. Okay. I believe that when I was looking into conditioning for a bunch of different teams, for a bunch of like pro play, I noticed one particular trend, and that is agents that are oppressive in nature, okay, or can give some sort of space are more dangerous and are easier to condition with, right? So we talked about how this character right here, if it would let me not highlight over it, Jet, maybe something like Chamber, maybe something like maybe Phoenix, right? We talked about how those characters don't necessarily have a piece of their kit that gives them the ability to sell a push, but they have a kit designated for taking space. So if you were, for example, use a dart, something that you could just use, maybe this eye right here, something that you could very easily ignore, and then you combine it with someone that will create that threat, you can instead use it to show some early presence, okay, take that space quickly, and at the same time, you can also try to help your team sell the idea that this is where the push is happening, okay? Fakes are also really useful when you're using conditioning to make this sort of like idea happen, okay? But more on fakes later, okay? How about something like Race? Race is a very powerful kit as well and can do pretty much the same thing Jet can. Obviously, there's some differences in how they move and how they can execute these things, right? But there is a little added benefit of her having some utility that she can use for selling a push. And I'm going to bring back the good old days, back before she got nerfed. Before, as Raze, the duration of the boombot allowed you to do a lineup that lasted the duration of being able to clear all of this. And it was pretty common for race players, maybe in ranked, maybe in pro play, to use this lineup right here to be able to clear all of hookah, or like the majority of it. Okay? This is something different than that of Jet, who actually had to put herself out there to be able to sell this push. Looking at the differences between these agents, okay, can help you figure out how the concept of conditioning can be applied to either of them. Okay? Do I have any questions so far?
No.
Okay. Okay. So far we've covered, okay, utility, a lot of different rules on how you're going to be using utility for conditioning. Agents themselves have the possibility of being able to create some sort of space, to create some sort of conditioning, right? But at the end of the day, we're also looking at that oppressive space. Those characters that can take that space quickly, right? We're looking at something like Fade. Fade can very quickly start dogging this area, right? You're going to start paying attention to it, right? The more aggressive, the more non-refundable a play is, the higher chance it has at creating some sort of conditioning for the opponent. And this is why I'm talking about making sure that you're doing it as early as you are at the beginning of the game. Okay? Round one, you need to make sure you make a decision on how you're going to play your character. Because what's going to happen is, when you're making an aggressive play, when you're making some sort of maybe sort of push or anything like that, at the end of the day, the more non-refundable it is, the harder it is for the enemy to believe that you're not going to push. Okay. So for example, if I'm going to start here and I want to push this area, throwing down the smokes, maybe throwing a flash out, maybe a dash, all of that will sell the push, right? So think of all the abilities that the enemy might throw that you might neglect. So for example, you might start here and they throw a flash. You might have dodged it, but you just completely neglect it, right? Back then, Sky was basically, I think she still is, dominant on bind, right? You kind of just expect this flash to happen. Why? Because it's refundable. It doesn't really matter, right? They can throw a flash. Then you see Omen, right? Omen might throw his smokes and you're like, okay, well, these smokes might be good, but I'm hearing no presence. This might be the case for a fake, right? Or maybe you see only one smoke and it's in heaven, like something like that, right? Again, it's refundable. You don't really care. But then the second that you start hearing footsteps, the second that you start hearing more non-refundable utility, right? You start hearing satchels, maybe a nade, something that's providing pressure. You start paying attention because it shows commitment, okay? And that's going to be the theme from here onwards. Commitment is basically what helps sell plays. You don't necessarily have to commit, but you have to show some intention behind commitment. And this is why the difference between Jet and Race might come in, because Jet can easily clear this, right? But because she used nothing for it, she doesn't necessarily have to stay there, nor do you have to respect it. You only have to respect it, of course, once you start taking side, and then that becomes a problem because she's in your area. When Raze is doing it with way more intention than Jet is, right? She's using utility. She has a kit to be able to fully clear this. Again, we're talking in the scope of how she used to be played, right? She can come all the way over here. Maybe she can throw like a little Roomba over here, clear this area, right? The like. But because she's using utility, you start paying attention more to it. Hey, she used Roomba. Hey, she's doing this. It only becomes a problem the second that she starts using way more utility. Okay. So, let me see. So this is why we're going to be looking at utility and commitment. Okay. So again, we have no questions on playstyles. We have no questions on characters. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about using these playstyles, using this commitment to call a bluff. Okay. Has anyone called a bluff in a game before? Does anyone know what it is? Does anyone want to take a guess at it? Any takers?
So like, I'd say that it's like when you call someone's bluff, it's like, is it like trying to like fool them, like knowing that where they're gonna come, like trying to like predict when Omen's gonna spawn and then killing him.
Yep, that's a good example of it. Yeah, I like that. Okay, trying to catch when the enemy might make a play, trying to make sure you have a read of it. Any other takers?
Would it be like when you're making like a fake play with like a wall or something?
That's right. You making a play. That would be the enemy having to call your bluff. But yes, it's on the right, and it's on the same track.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so far we talked a lot about, utility, commitment, all that type of stuff. Remember what we talked about, that utility. So we're going to bring it back. Maybe Soba just likes to throw this dart, right? Beginning of the round, right? We talked about how it might be there, might not be there. But we talked about how it doesn't really show that much aggression. It doesn't really show that much presence. Okay. We talked a lot about how a condition might make an opponent play differently, right? And how different utility might have different effects. So when it comes to calling a bluff, it's pretty much you reading this little dart right there and saying they're not going to do anything with it. It is just for info. That's calling a bluff. Okay. Calling a bluff is it's easier on less oppressive utility, okay? So making sure you're paying attention to things like for example, turret is a good example of breaking that, right? Maybe you're kind of like pushing up on a scent and you see this little turret right here, right? Like you can break this, for example. That's an example of setting that condition, right? It's very light. It's not very oppressive. Same thing over here. Maybe we're doing something like breaking this dart. The dart is being thrown right there. You're not going to think anything of it. You're just going to shoot that utility. Well, what happens is calling a bluff is essentially looking at that utility that's being used. It's not very oppressive. Nothing's really happening with it. And you make a counterplay. The dart is being thrown from here. Okay, so that means that we have at least one player there. And because there's never someone pushing up, or every single time they've done that, there's really nothing here. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to be playing off of that dart as an aggressive play. And that's a counterplay that you're going to do. You're going to call the bluff. Okay. Because at the end of the day, when Sova throws a dart, he could be holding an angle, he could be running back to his team, right? But just because, you know, they throw that dart doesn't mean they're going to stay there forever. Okay? These strategies that you come up with will always have to do with calling a bluff. My suggestion to players is you always got to make sure that when people are trying to bait you by using these pieces of utility, by using like these little pieces right there, for example, like I mentioned, turret or dart, right? That you're paying attention to the utility just past what it might mean and what it's actually doing. If no one is pushing behind this, if no one's playing behind this area right here by the turret, right, then it's pretty much just being wasted. And you want to make sure that you're staying one step ahead of the enemy by communicating what the moves are going to be, right? So this is why, again, you want to make sure you start really early in the game, because otherwise you might throw a dart with the intention of baiting the opponent. Oh, I threw a dart here. They're going to really think that we're pushing up or something like that, right? It's not really going to do anything. Instead, you want to make sure that you get those reads. At the beginning of the round, they like to throw this area right there. They don't do anything with it. So that means there's a solo player over here, right? And then you can kind of spend some time using that utility. Of course, depending on the map, depending on the location that you're at, sometimes it might be hard. Okay. My suggestion to people is that when you are playing against opponents that like to just do that solo utility, you pay attention to what piece of utility it is. So for example, if we have someone like Breach that is doing his little concuss right there, it is a lot harder for you to call a bluff against a Breach because Breach likes to stay close with something like a Jet. Not to mention that they're really self-sufficient because they have flashes. So make sure you pay attention to who you're trying to push, and make sure that when you're calling a bluff on the opponent, make sure that they used up the utility that you don't want them to use. So if they're trying to sell a push right here and they use this and a bunch of flashes, and then they start retreating, now you'll know for next time that you can just account for one flash if they do decide to push back. Okay? Little convoluted, but at the same time, it's just about making a gut decision play. Just make it happen and kind of work with that based on the result. Okay. So now that we understand that we have different forms of plays, now that we understand that each individual play that they make might be a bluff, might not be a bluff, let's talk about using these conditions to set some sort of standard and create a fake. Okay. So we talked about how some agents are more aggressive than others. They're more oppressive than others. Okay. If you hear some sort of utility being thrown down the line over here, do you think that it is better for your team to start rotating? Or do you think it is better for everybody to stay? Okay. What do you think is the best answer if you start seeing a lot of utility come down one lane? What do you think is the best response to it? Do you have a rotation? Do you stay? Do you think it's a fake? What do you think?
I'd say it's probably like a fake. There's a high chance it can just be a fake throwing out util, but usually like have like at least a few people stay there, but have the majority have like one person stay A just in case, but have the majority stay at B, right?
Yeah, that's pretty good. So once more, just to come back to the same topic of commitment, right? When they sell a lot of utility, there's going to be that idea of commitment being placed. And remember, in order for them to really think that's going to happen, you got to make sure that you feel like you're going to commit to that site, right? For you to be able to properly sell a fake, you got to understand that both options of them rotating off and staying are both equally viable. They can keep their anchors where they are. They might not. They might fully rotate depending on how much utility is being spent, right? Both of these are equally viable. The problem is, how do you execute it so you actually get the rotation pulled, right? That's what becomes a problem for some players, and that's what becomes a real issue for players that want to make sure that, you know, a fake is actually happening. And this is where conditioning comes into play. Okay? You can only get them to be pulled off if they're already expecting that play to happen. Okay? So let's say, for example, at the beginning of the round, you've always thrown this dart. Well, that doesn't really mean much if you want to create a fake, right? How about if we create something like that and then we throw drone, right? Well, that's a little bit more utility, not really enough to sell the push. What if we start putting in a couple more sets of footsteps and maybe a flash? Well, it starts becoming a lot more aggressive. there's a bigger threat. The enemy starts to respect it a little more. Still not enough to get them to be convinced. Now do that 3 times, right? After doing that like I would say like 3 times, right? A bunch of times, the enemy is going to start reading that this is the initial sign that the enemy should start rotating, right? So let's say every single time you're pushing A site, right? You're pushing A site and mid every single round. Well, this is going to hit an expectation that whenever you make utility being thrown towards A, or you have some sort of knife hit towards like cat, then you're making that play happen. You want some sort of trigger that lets the enemy know that this is the push that's going to happen. So for example, out of these 3 pieces of utility that were thrown, which one do you think is enough to sell the fake? Do you think it's the dart, the drone, or the flash? Where do you think the enemy starts to believe that this is an actual push? Ask yourself that question. What do you think is the answer?
I'd say it's the dart, because it's like more, yeah, because you can see it like on the map, so it gives you like more insight on where they will be.
Okay. Any other takers?
Say the drone.
I say drone.
Okay, drone. We have a droner. What else?
I say flash.
Okay, we have a flash. Okay. So remember, let's break
I
it.
also think it's the flash.
Okay, so let's break it down based on the concepts. So if we know that we're going to try to sell a fake, this piece of utility right here is not enough to sell a fake. It is enough to get the information that there's a Sova nearby, but not enough to sell a fake. Drone. So far, the same agent has used 2 pieces of utility, right? It is not enough to really let us know that there's more players. The flash, however, indicates that there's some sort of threat with the space that has been scanned.
Oh.
Right? Notice how we're going back to that commitment. It's not just one character doing it. Now we start introducing the concept of commitment. And usually commitment shows more than one player. Okay? Let's go through another example. Okay, let me see if I can come up with something really quickly. Let's say you start over here. You have race, right? We have a stun happen. This is number 1. We have a race satchel, maybe potentially on top of here, maybe into sight a little bit. Again, they're not really pushing in sight. You don't know. So it might be a satchel, right? Actually, I should use a different map for this. No, fuck it. We're going to keep this one. Okay, we have race satchel. We have, at this point in time, we have some sort of info utility. Maybe the dart is being thrown. And last but not least, maybe you see a smoke. Okay, let's say that this is what the team decides to do as a push. I'm not going to really ask why they did that, but that's the push. Okay, at what point in time, as the receiver of this push, do you start respecting the push? Is it the stun? Is it the satchel? Okay. Is it the info utility? Or is it the smoke? And again, I gave it to you guys in sequence. 1, 2, 3, 4. Where do you think that you draw the line at this is where the push is starting to happen?
True.
Sorry?
Actually, I don't know. If I was throwing a fake, I would definitely send my duels to die.
Yeah, that's a good one.
3.
Yeah, 3. Okay. What else? Who else? We have 1 vote for 3.
I agree with 3.
Okay. Any other takers? No more takers? All right. You guys are right. It is the dart. So let's kind of walk through it as to why that's the case, right? We first have the first piece of utility that was used. It is a cooldown. It can be dodged. There's really no reason for us to think that that's enough to kind of pull out some sort of utility. The satchel is a really close pick. I wouldn't be surprised if you picked that as well, right? The satchel is a really good indication that we're putting some sort of pressure. Maybe they're kind of pushing this way, right? But again, we have no vision, so we don't really know what they're doing with that. But it is a non-refundable play, right? But then we start throwing something like the dart. At this point in time, we've used 3 pieces of utility. That's letting us know that they're ready to start pushing. Okay. Let's do one more. And then from there, we can kind of move on to the next side. Let's pick bind. Okay, same thing. We have race. First thing you hear is Roomba. Beginning. Okay, this is what's happening. Then what happens afterwards, you hear a dart go off, right? And then last but not least, you hear drone go off. At what point in time do you go, okay, this is actually a push? Do you do it with the Roomba? Do you do it with the, oh, and last but not least, we have something like maybe a flash over here, perhaps, just to sell the push, you know? At what point in time do we start thinking this is actually a push that's happening?
Is the answer flash again, or is it like is the same answer flash?
Oh.
We have one.
I want to say the
I don't know. I was the drone, but also
I wanna
you
say the
don't have
drone.
sky flashes anymore, like the refund. So
Would-
No,
would
I say the drone because she already threw hookah to clear out, or she already threw Roomba to clear out hookah. So if you're committing drone, that means that they're definitely pushing.
Yeah, that's the answer. You got it bang on. That's the one. Okay. So we're kind of mixing a bunch of different concepts. I want to make sure that we're really like on the dot on this one because faking is really hard and understanding the push is going to be really hard. So if you guys know the amount of utility that you're spending, every single time, maybe for example, you use a non-refundable utility, you can say like +1. Sorry, and then non-refundable, you can say +2. And then once you reach like a threshold maybe of 3 or 4, then you can start thinking, okay, maybe this is a push. By no means does this always mean a push though. And this is why you can start using this form of addition to kind of start thinking, this is how much utility we really need to get them to think this is a push, right? This is how you can start using this amount of utility to kind of add them up in sequence to create that fake, right? So it's not just the Roomba that's necessary, right? But then the second that this dart is being thrown, again, you're like thinking, well, one of them is refundable. It's not really going to mean much. But then the second that drone is put in, the threat of the space that has been taken is higher. The amount of non-refundable utility thrown is higher. And the amount of space you've lost is higher, right? There's a bigger threat here. And that's enough to create a reaction from the enemy. They might expect a push. Maybe they don't fully rotate, but they could expect some sort of push. It might pull people off of the front lines into something that's a little bit closer to a rotation, right? That's something that you can't expect. This is just overkill. In fact, you could use it if you really wanted to sell that, but at this point in time, you're wasting more players than you need. This is why when I see players use something like Breach Jet, they have a really easy time selling the push because all they have to use is a singular flash, stun, and maybe a smoke, perhaps dash, right? Enough non-refundable utility that's perhaps enough to sell that play while the rest of the team is pushing in. So in order for you guys to use that sort of that sort of conditioning that you've been doing, you just have to look at the play that you've done before. Let's say that the addition to this play is you always finalize it with some smokes. Well, around this point in time, the enemy knows that this is the push because they've seen it so many times. Does that make sense? Any questions on that?
No, I get it now.
Okay, good. So basically what's happening is we're seeing a play. The play is happening a lot of times to the point that you can actually cut your utility in half and maybe go to the point of using drone in order to be able to properly sell the push. Okay, so again, you got to make sure that you're kind of paying attention to utility, making sure there's a threat, making sure you've actually set this play in stone before. Because let's say you're using the dart and you instead throw a dart over there. Well, that's a new play. They don't know what to do with that, right? You're going to need more utility to sell it once it's different. That's why you got to make sure that there's repetition. You got to make sure that you've done the same thing over and over again. You got to make sure that that piece of utility has been used before, okay? Because if all of a sudden you're not doing this and you're throwing this flash, it's a brand new play. Soba could not even be here at this point, right? You got to make sure that you're doing the same thing over and over again, not only to sell fakes, but also to make a play on conditioning. Okay, we're gonna do one last one, and then I might split the breaking conditioning and info denial for a bigger topic later. For now, let's just talk about creating unsafe space. So we've now understand a little bit more about how conditioning works. Okay, We've created ways for how defenders and attackers might potentially use conditioning to create some sort of threat. Well, at this point in time, we're now going to be covering how conditioning can be preset as a form of creating unsafe space. So I always use Ascent as this example, right? So let's say at the beginning of the round, you guys like to push B, and then, all of a sudden, Raze and Astra decide to put a star here, and they like to nade it, okay? This is a consequence of your actions. You decide to push in, you didn't properly clear, you weren't ready, you all rushed, and then they read it, you got punished for it, okay? What's going to happen if you're playing and you're ready to push B and you see this star right there? What do you expect?
You're most likely gonna expect the was it the one that pulls you in, right?
Yeah, the one that pulls you in, right? You're going to expect the pull and potentially a nade, right? This is how learning works. This is how conditioning works. If at the beginning of every round you're doing this little star right there, not even with the intention of pulling, you're creating unsafe space. Okay? Artificial pressure like this is critical when you're playing something like defense or when you're trying to play against a team that's really smart at setting traps, right? Against pushing. You want to make sure you're setting traps, okay? So it is critical to create artificial space as much as possible. However, you got to make sure that you don't do it alone. So let me give you an example of something that I see a lot from players. At the beginning of the round, I've voted players that, let's say, for example, they like to play race, pistol round, for example. Beginning of the round, they like to throw a nade right here at the beginning. And I asked them, why do you do that? Well, maybe I'll get some chip damage, right? Sure, that's right. What happens if this is happening every single time? They're going to dodge it. They're going to expect it. They're going to play back, right? This piece of utility right there, it's done. And then that piece of space is now gone, right? It is very quick. It is very pointless at the end of the day. What if we combine it with something else, however? What if we do this and maybe you follow it up with something else? Maybe we follow it with, instead of doing this at the beginning, we wait for noise. Maybe we flash out and then follow up with a nade, right? Again, these plays are just complete examples. I'm not saying do this in your games. You could if you want to. But what's happening right now is you've now created a consequence to this space. And what's happening is, even though you guys are not actually throwing this utility, the mere action of you guys existing around this area creates very unsafe space in this box right here. And this is how teams that like to play passively tend to do the best at, okay? Look at a team like C9, for example. They have a pretty aggressive comp, but at the end of the day, what they're trying to do is set traps for the enemy to be sprung upon. You want to make sure you're dealing with those extra attackers, right? And if you remember that one VOD we did a while ago, that's actually what FUT was doing as well. They were just setting up traps for the enemy, just poor communication on their part. And that's actually what's happening right here. You're setting up traps by creating some sort of threat. And it can be done from a couple rounds. Let's say they're coming in and you throw that flash, then you throw a nade. Over time, the enemy will start to respect this space, that they'll start making plays around this unsafe space. So not only do they have to worry about taking sight with that utility, but they have to use it by taking this space as well. And this is what creating unsafe space does, okay? It is a great form of creating dangerous space that, if ignored, will cause some sort of consequence, okay? And it can be very opportunistic against the right crowd. So for example, you do this flash, instead of throwing that nade, you can follow it up with an ult instead, right? These are things that you guys can do. You guys can combo this all the time. But this form of conditioning is pretty strong and can only be negated if the enemy finds new routes around it, which is what the next lesson is going to be about, switching it up a little bit. But we have no time for that. Okay. Remember, if you plan to fail, right? You're not really going to get far, or as the quote says, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail, right? You got to make sure that you got to have some sort of control right here. You got to make sure that you have some sort of plan behind the play that you're doing. Otherwise, you're not going to really get anything done. Communicate to your team. You guys have like 30 seconds per round. Maybe you can come up with something, okay? Does anyone have any questions on conditioning, creating unsafe space, setting fakes, calling bluffs, anything of the like? None?
Nah.
Okay, that's a nah. Okay, I'm going to call it here. Big reminder, we're going to be doing part 2 on this on Thursday. So just wait out for that one. We're going to be covering more advanced topics. We're going to be doing more advanced topics like breaking that conditioning, using ultimates for fakes, and alternating between rounds, which if you kind of need to